Most power struggles in the Middle East aren't decided by leaders, speeches, or troop numbers. They're shaped by systems that don't respond to authority at all. One naval base, one energy corridor, one timing window can quietly override decades of planning, long before decisions are visible. The idea that the United States can simply control the Middle East assumes power behaves like command. In reality, power here behaves like pressure inside closed systems. Influence doesn't expand evenly. It compresses, leaks, and shifts. What looks like dominance often masks a shrinking set of options. This breakdown follows 10 structural reasons, each tightening the system further. The final reason isn't the most dramatic, but it explains why earlier decisions quietly removed later choices, long before outcomes felt inevitable. By the end of this video, you'll understand why. Control in the Middle East fails first at the water. The Strait of Hormuz is barely wide enough for 2 shipping lanes, yet it carries a fifth of the world's traded oil. American power enters this region assuming movement is guaranteed. It is not. The situation forms quietly. Carrier groups, tankers, and logistics ships all funnel through the same narrow passage. This concentration creates efficiency, but it also creates predictability. Pressure builds as even small actors gain leverage by simply being present near the corridor. The decision point comes early. Protect every transit or accept intermittent disruption. Neither choice restores freedom. Delay deepens the problem because traffic cannot disperse. Routes here do not spread, they compress. Pause here. Control is no longer about command, it is about tolerance for risk. Once movement depends on negotiated passage, future options narrow. Escalation risks global markets. Restraint invites repeated testing. Over time, deterrence shifts from preventing action to managing frequency. Not dominance, position. The consequence is structural. Military reach remains vast, but operational flexibility shrinks. Each response must consider the corridor first, not the objective. Strategy becomes reactive to geography rather than directed by intent. From this point forward, pressure accumulates quietly. The next constraint emerges from economic systems reacting faster than strategy. The economic consequences arrive before the military ones. When processing facilities like Cake go offline, even briefly, global markets react in minutes. Prices move. Insurance rates spike. Political pressure follows almost immediately. The situation forms beneath the surface. Energy infrastructure in the Gulf is built for efficiency, not resilience. Centralized facilities reduce cost and increase output, but they also concentrate vulnerability. Pressure builds as markets internalize this fragility faster than any government can respond. The decision point is rarely explicit. Escalate to guarantee stability or absorb disruption and signal restraint. Delay feels prudent, but markets do not wait for clarification. Every hour of uncertainty narrows the range of acceptable responses. Pause here. Strategy has not failed yet. Time has. Once price volatility enters domestic politics, foreign policy flexibility collapses. Leaders begin managing consequences instead of shaping conditions. Options that were viable days earlier become politically unusable. Not control, exposure. The consequence compounds. Even successful deterrence cannot prevent market anxiety. Insurance premiums remain elevated. Shipping hesitates. Allies recalibrate quietly. Economic systems begin steering strategy rather than supporting it. From this point, influence depends less on intent and more on tolerance for instability. The region does not need sustained disruption to exert pressure. Brief uncertainty is enough. As economic signals harden, the next constraint emerges. Technology shortens reaction windows faster than decision systems can adapt. The limitation appears as speed. Sensor networks, drones, and low-cost precision systems now saturate the region. Radar sites, launch platforms, and surveillance feeds compress decision time on all sides. The situation forms gradually. Advanced detection was meant to stabilize by increasing awareness. Instead, it accelerates confrontation. Pressure builds as warning windows shrink from days to minutes. Assumptions about deliberate escalation no longer hold. The decision point becomes compressed. Respond immediately or risk losing initiative. Delay is interpreted as weakness. Action risks miscalculation. Neither restores control. Pause here. Strategy needs time. Technology removes it. As reaction time collapses, planning gives way to reflex. Command structures built for hierarchy struggle to keep pace with distributed systems. Small incidents demand immediate answers, even when their strategic value is unclear. Not superiority, saturation. The consequence is structural. Precision reduces damage but increases frequency. Engagement becomes normalized at lower thresholds. Each action invites calibration rather than resolution. Over time, restraint erodes not from intent, but from tempo. Future options narrow sharply. De-escalation requires pauses that the system no longer allows. Escalation risks cascading responses across tightly linked networks. At this stage, military posture hardens by default. The next pressure point is not technology itself, but where forces are physically fixed in place. The contradiction becomes visible on land. Forward bases like Al-Assad Air Base are designed to project stability, yet their permanence creates fixed points in an increasingly fluid environment. Presence signals commitment, but it also creates targets that cannot move. The situation forms through necessity. To respond quickly, forces must be close. To reassure partners, they must stay visible. Pressure builds as these installations absorb regional tension without dispersing it. What was meant to deter instead concentrates attention. The decision point arrives quietly. Reinforce and escalate the footprint, or reduce exposure and accept gaps. Delay feels safer, but fixed bases do not benefit from waiting. Their location defines their vulnerability. Pause here. Mobility has already been traded for access. Once forces are tied to specific sites, strategy narrows. Force protection begins shaping operational choices. Missions are selected not by strategic value, but by risk to infrastructure and personnel. Not projection, exposure. The consequence deepens over time. Adversaries do not need to defeat these positions. They only need to threaten them persistently. This shifts the balance from initiative to defense, from shaping events to preventing loss. Future options thin out. Withdrawal signals retreat. Reinforcement signals escalation. Remaining in place signals endurance without control. Each path reduces flexibility rather than restoring it. At this stage, power is no longer about what can be done, but about what must be defended. Geography has fixed the board. The next pressure emerges where borders stop functioning as boundaries and become corridors. Control erodes further where borders fail to contain movement. The Al-Qaim crossing between Iraq and Syria looks administrative on a map. In practice, it functions as a corridor that power cannot fully seal. The situation forms after prolonged conflict weakens state enforcement. Borders remain drawn, but authority thins. Pressure builds as roots outlast governments. Traffic adapts. Influence flows through continuity, not recognition. The decision point is indirect. Enforce borders with constant presence or rely on local partners to manage transit. Delay appears pragmatic, but corridors do not pause. They normalize alternative control. Pause here. The line still exists. Control does not. As land routes stabilize, leverage disperses. Weapons, personnel, and supplies move through spaces that are governed unevenly. Each successful transit reduces the credibility of centralized authority. Each failure invites replication. Not command, coordination. The consequence compounds. The United States must now manage influence through intermediaries, not institutions. Authority becomes negotiated, conditional, and reversible. Strategic intent passes through too many hands to remain intact. Future options narrow. Direct control requires escalation across multiple sovereignties. Indirect control requires accepting diluted outcomes. Neither restores the original assumption of command. Over time, borders stop functioning as strategic breaks. They become transmission lines for pressure, linking conflicts instead of isolating them. At this point, power depends less on territory and more on relationships. The next constraint emerges when allies begin quietly recalculating their own survival priorities. Alliances narrow before they break. In the Gulf, security partnerships look firm on paper, yet each state faces a different clock. Shared threats exist, but shared risk tolerance does not. The situation forms as regional governments hedge quietly. Arms purchases continue. Intelligence sharing persists. Pressure builds as partners prepare for outcomes they do not fully control. Survival planning replaces alignment. The decision point is rarely public. Commit fully to a U.S.-led posture or preserve flexibility for regional shifts. Delay feels rational, but it signals uncertainty. Allies begin spacing their bets. Pause here. Cohesion is already thinning. As priorities diverge, coordination slows. Responses require consultation instead of action. Signals soften to avoid alienating partners who may not follow. What was once deterrence becomes ambiguity, not unity, alignment fatigue. The consequence tightens. Coalition power remains large, but it moves unevenly. Each member's hesitation becomes a shared constraint. Adversaries exploit this by testing edges rather than centers. Future options contract. Acting decisively risks fragmenting alliances. Acting cautiously invites incremental pressure. Either path reduces leverage over time. At this stage, influence depends on consensus maintenance rather than outcome control. Strategy bends toward keeping coalitions intact, even when effectiveness declines. The next pressure does not come from diplomacy, but from economic systems adapting around restrictions. Economic pressure rarely collapses systems. It reroutes them. Sanctions imposed on Iran were designed to restrict access, yet over time they produced parallel networks that operate beyond formal oversight. The situation forms gradually. Official trade declines, but alternative shipping routes, informal banking channels, and regional intermediaries expand. Pressure builds as enforcement costs rise faster than compliance. Each restriction encourages adaptation rather than surrender. The decision point is structural. Tighten sanctions further or accept diminishing returns. Delay feels strategic, but parallel systems mature quietly. Once established, they are difficult to dismantle without broader disruption. Pause here. Pressure is still applied. Control is not. As informal networks stabilize, leverage weakens. Economic activity continues at reduced efficiency, but with greater resilience. The system absorbs pain and redistributes it unevenly, often away from decision makers. Not restriction, redirection. The consequence is cumulative. Sanctions lose their shock value. Enforcement becomes labor-intensive. Partners weigh compliance against their own exposure. Over time, economic tools stop shaping behavior and start shaping workarounds. Future options narrow sharply. Lifting pressure restores legitimacy to parallel systems. Escalating pressure risks alienating partners and destabilizing markets. Holding steady locks in stalemate. At this stage, economic influence no longer dictates outcomes. It conditions the environment, setting limits without resolving tensions. As financial leverage plateaus, strategy turns again toward military signaling, where credibility becomes the next fragile constraint. Deterrence weakens without visibly failing. Missile defense batteries and forward-deployed systems are meant to signal control, but over time they expose a different truth. Deterrence depends on credibility, not hardware. The situation forms through repetition. Intercepts succeed. Responses remain measured. Pressure builds as adversaries learn the thresholds. They do not challenge strength directly. They test resolve at the margins. The decision point narrows. Respond forcefully and risk escalation, or respond proportionally and invite the next probe. Delay feels stabilizing, but it teaches predictability. Each calibrated response becomes a data point. Pause here. The signal has been received. As deterrence is exercised without escalation, its meaning shifts. Threats lose weight. Red lines blur. What once prevented action now merely shapes its timing. Control becomes symbolic rather than decisive. Not strength, restraint. The consequence compounds quietly. Defensive systems multiply, but they do not restore initiative. They manage risk while absorbing pressure. Over time, posture replaces strategy. Avoiding loss becomes the objective. Future options narrow. Escalation carries alliance risk. De-escalation carries credibility cost. Standing still invites normalization of challenge. None of these paths restore leverage. At this stage, military signaling sustains presence but not resolution. Control is maintained in appearance, while flexibility erodes underneath. The next constraint emerges where precision reduces damage. but increases the tempo of confrontation beyond strategic control. Precision was supposed to contain conflict. Instead, it made confrontation sustainable. Precision-guided strikes, limited in scale and damage, lower the immediate cost of action while increasing how often it occurs. The situation forms through restraint. Targets are selected carefully. Collateral damage is minimized. Pressure builds as each successful strike proves that escalation can be managed. The threshold for action quietly drops. The decision point becomes routine. Strike to reassert credibility or pause and risk signaling hesitation. Delay feels safer, but silence is read as space. Precision removes the shock that once forced reconsideration. Pause here. Violence has become procedural. As precision normalizes engagement, strategy fragments. Tactical success no longer translates into strategic change. Each strike resets the cycle without closing it. Control exists only in the moment of execution, not resolution, management. The consequence hardens over time. Conflict settles into a low-intensity rhythm. Actors adapt expectations. Retaliation becomes calibrated, not avoided. The system stabilizes around friction instead of peace. Future options narrow further. Escalating breaks the logic of precision and risks uncontrollable spillover. De-escalating abandons the only tool still perceived as credible. Maintaining the pattern locks all sides into repetition. At this stage, the illusion of control persists because outcomes remain limited. But limitation is not direction. Strategy has lost its end state. What follows is not another tactical failure, but a deeper system truth, one that explains why this pattern extends beyond the Middle East itself. The deepest constraint is not military, economic, or technological. It is structural. The Middle East functions as a convergence zone where global roots, energy flows, security guarantees, and regional rivalries overlap within compressed geography. No external power controls convergence zones. They absorb pressure and redistribute it. The situation forms over decades. Strategies assume outcomes can be stabilized through presence and persistence. Pressure builds as each intervention interacts with systems already under strain. Effects compound sideways rather than forward. The decision point arrives late. Adapt strategy to permanent constraint or continue managing symptoms. Delay feels acceptable because collapse is gradual. There is no single failure moment. Control erodes through accumulation. Pause here. Nothing has gone wrong, everything has closed. As options disappear, power is redefined. Success becomes endurance. Influence becomes the ability to remain engaged without resolution. Position matters more than achievement. Timing matters more than force, not control. Constraint acceptance. The long-term consequence extends beyond the region. This model now shapes how power operates in other chokepoint-driven theaters. Strategy shifts from decisive outcomes to risk management. Precedent replaces victory. Future decisions inherit this logic. Once geography fixes decision points, leadership choices operate inside narrowing corridors. Flexibility becomes temporary. Authority becomes conditional. The system does not collapse dramatically. It settles. Pressure equalizes. Movement continues, but direction fades. This is why control never arrives. Not because power is insufficient, but because the structure does not allow it.